I guess I'll start out with just a little about me. My background is in architecture and city planning. I came to design through more of a roundabout kind of path. I wasn't interested in going into architecture or city planning. I was really focused on oral history and costuming. When I was doing an independent study in undergrad, I was looking a lot at maroon communities. I was really interested in the idea of language death and the process or the sort of contradiction in trying to communicate your truth, trying to communicate about your life and your culture through someone else's language, and what that means and what that does to a community. And in the process of doing that research, I was really interested in the Great Dismal Swamp, which was right by where I grew up, which was where a maroon community of fugitive slaves was located for well over a century, and also looking at the South Carolina Low Country. Sorry, I always get really nervous in presentations. So in particular, during that independent study, I was looking at the South Carolina Low Country. The Gullah community there, as maroon communities tend to function, but in particular this community had been in certain ways insulated from the effects that colonization have on a language. And so there are there's a very particular dialect, but also a lot of songs and stories that had been told and passed down generation from generation from generation since those initially enslaved people were brought over to the country. And so in the process of, I should go to the next slide, in the process of, through all of those generations, they managed to hold on to this one specific song. And an ethnographer went out to this community to study them, to study the dialect, and in the process of being in that community, had recorded this song and continued doing his research, and ended up going to was trying to match that dialect and study where that dialect had come from, and had traced it back to Africa, to the specific country, to the specific tribe where that song had come from, and it was the exact same song, it hadn't changed. So centuries later, this was in the turn of the 20th century, the song had not changed. And they brought that tribe and the Gullah community together, and they sang the song together, and it was still the exact same song. And I think about that a lot in terms of how Black communities have been displaced over and over and over again, and what that does when you lose that connection to your story, when you lose that connection to your community, to your culture, to your place, and how hard it is to reconnect to that every time you get pushed over to a new place. And I think about that, and I think about the design profession, which is the profession that I've chosen, which is a profession that has systematically terrorized communities of color for decades, for centuries, intentionally. And I wonder a lot, as a Black designer, how can you go into a community with intention? How can you go into a community and bring tools and help to increase agency, as opposed to exerting pressure, as opposed to just dropping something down, as opposed to doing something that causes genuine harm? So I want to be very clear that when we're thinking about these stories that we're telling about our neighborhoods, when we're thinking about these stories that we're telling about displacement, we focus a lot on the trauma that exists in it, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that trauma tonight. But the ultimate goal of my work is in figuring out how to preserve communities of color, how to preserve Black communities. And I think that a large part of that comes from, a large part of the potential for preservation, and a large part of what we need to do actively in order to preserve, is to tell stories, and is to connect those stories with other folks who are experiencing those same pushes of gentrification, those same pushes of trauma, those same things that we see crop up in every community, because every time it shows up in a community, it feels like it's the first time, because it's so fresh and it's so difficult and it's so hard. It's very unique to that community, but at the same time, it is something that has happened over and over and over again. It is something that is happening everywhere around us. But every time it happens, it feels like it's the first time, because we are so disconnected from the next community over. And so how do we go about layering those stories? How do we go about connecting folks and getting people to tell the same story and understand that they're telling the same story, maybe just in slightly different languages, slightly different experiences? So in approaching the fellowship and approaching my larger research, I'm really interested in how to understand, how to get to that storytelling lens from an interpersonal level, from an institutional level, and hopefully through the two of those angles into an intracommunal sort of midpoint or connection point, sort of a conduit. So I'm getting nervous again. So in looking at those three phases, can you hear me again? I'm realizing I'm stepping away from the microphone. In looking at those three phases, I'm wanting to connect and integrate community members to design and preservation through the lens of community building. I'm wanting institutions to be based in their neighborhood preservation tactics and lived experiences of the communities that they're serving. And ideally, by going through those two lenses, prioritizing the open sharing of knowledge across Black communities to make a replicable model of preservation. The way that I'm doing that is through mapping right now. Through the first phase, which I'm considering my interpersonal sort of realm. I'm treating this as a 3-year research project, so this first year has been about developing the interpersonal angle of it. And the interpersonal angle for me has been in the collective mapping process, where the idea has been to sit down with different groups of people over this map and go through a series of guided question and answer kind of activities, or not kind of activities. They're activities where everyone is sitting down with a marker and everyone is sitting down with sticky notes and pens, and we're talking together to understand how your experience physically connects to your neighborhood. So if you're looking at a specific street corner, or if we're asking a specific, there's going to be prettier maps. You don't have to take a picture of this one. This is multiple maps layered together. So the point being, if you can do enough of these exercises where everyone can start to, I have no questions here. I should have reordered it. Where everyone can go through these questions together in a series of activities and really start to see, okay, well, you know, my experience maps out here, and this person that I'm next to, okay, they're also having this traumatic experience on this block. They also don't feel comfortable walking down this block, or this is also their favorite street corner, or they also see people sitting on this corner all the time. Not necessarily a good or a bad thing, not putting a connotation at this moment, but this is starting to be a pattern that we're seeing. And if we can do this activity over and over and over again, and then get to the point where we can then physically layer all of those maps together to look at what is the narrative that we are telling about our own community as opposed to the narrative that we're being told about our community, then we can start to think about how specific interventions or support methods in the physical realm can take root or can be conceived. So this is the product of all of the mapping exercises I've done so far layered together physically. Sorry, I hit the mic. I was doing it on transparent film paper. So when you layer them on top of each other, it looks really tricky, but that's all of the line work and all of the sticky notes and all of the things. And when you try to synthesize that down to what all people were saying, where they were pointing, that's what it ends up looking like. A lot of large gestures, a lot of really confusing lines, but a story. And that's kind of the human experience, right? It's a very confusing jumble of things. But when we start to distill it, we can understand what people are saying. So, a couple of the questions, I just picked a few so we can go through some examples of how it's working out. Two of the questions, and I was doing this in tiers of immediacy. So, it's going to seem like a few of these questions are the same thing, but what you see is that they'll lead to a very different result in the physical map that comes out of it. So where do you feel uncomfortable walking around? That was, I have a pointer that I should use. Does this actually point?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay. Clearly I practiced this. Where do you see people, where do you feel uncomfortable walking around? That's going to be in this orange color on here. I was highlighting specific blocks and specific lots that people were talking about. It's not precise. It's not to say that any one specific building or any one specific lot is really the problem or the lot to focus on, but this is the overall idea of what was happening in that other map. So, where do you feel uncomfortable walking around? uncomfortable can have a lot of different connotations based on who is hearing that question, and I was trying intentionally to keep this sort of open-ended. So where do you feel uncomfortable walking around might be, okay, maybe there's not a sidewalk here. Maybe there's a lot of traffic on this road. Maybe there's, this, maybe there's that. Versus where do you not feel welcome could mean, culturally, I don't think that this is a neighborhood or this is a block that I'm supposed to be on. What we're going to see is a lot of these same areas for those sorts of feelings are going to highlight over and over and over again, and other parts of the neighborhood are going to fall off the map. It's going to be like they don't exist. They're not within anyone's consciousness, right? So, what we see, where do you not feel welcome ended up being University of Houston, by and large. Folks of color didn't feel welcome, don't feel like this is a space for them, is what I was hearing. And Emancipation Park, which might be, there was a huge redesign project and folks don't necessarily feel like it was for them. They feel like, okay, well maybe I can go there if I'm dressed up in my work clothes and they'll think it's fine. Or maybe it feels like it's for all the white people who are moving in up here. So, starting to call these out, these are a little dark. I was trying to call out some examples of what those might be. So, in the case of, where do you feel uncomfortable walking around? A street that has no sidewalks, has a lot of parking on the side, has an open drainage ditch, and this is a little too dark to see what it is, but it's a gated townhome community where all of the buildings turn their backs and you cannot walk into it, and there is not really a sidewalk walking past it. So that's dropped down in the middle of their neighborhood and they're saying, yeah, I don't feel like I'm supposed to be around there. I feel like if I go there, I'm going to get into trouble, or someone will think that I'm in trouble. And what we can see when we look at it, so the other side of this is looking at the data. We're looking at how all of these emotional stories are layering onto the scientific, laying onto the metric tested, whatever. There is data to back up why people feel the way that they feel. So these orange lines are the the capital improvements program sidewalk improvements that have been completed in the last decade and a half. And so what we're seeing is, these are areas, only these ones, and these are specifically outside of third ward. There's a barrier line that's talking about what the technical third ward boundary is, which is also an interesting question depending on who you ask. It changes. This is the greater third ward boundary. But these sidewalks are talking about areas where, yeah, it might be more comfortable to walk around because there's been a capital improvement. There's been an investment into this part of the neighborhood. Whereas in other areas, there has very definitively not been. And what people say, people notice that. And what they also notice is that when developers are coming in and building those townhomes, they're building out a little tiny sliver of sidewalk for that one specific house, and then nothing else. So that's also a sign, yeah, no, you're not really welcome on this street. You shouldn't be walking around on this street. There isn't a space for you. I'm going backwards. Another question that I was trying to get into, or two other questions I was trying to get into, were around housing and around safety. So I asked, where is housing in the worst shape? And where do you feel unsafe? The places where people felt unsafe are these orange lots that kind of don't show up super well. But these orange purple places specifically, it wasn't a whole lot in the neighborhood. It was a very, very small few places, and safety means something different to everyone who answers it. But what you typically see is that the places where people are feeling unsafe are the places where housing is also in really bad shape. People are saying, I see kids coming out of houses that look like they're abandoned, and they live there. I see people living in houses that have tarps or that have big holes in them or that have boards all sides. And, maybe that's not a place that happens again. So, right, there's boards on all sides of the house, but there are people living in these spaces. And so is that a space that you're walking around? Is that a space where you want to be spending time? Is that a space where you feel like there's a strong community or there's a strong investment being made here? This picture is too small to see, but it's also reinforcing that. So a pattern that is going to show up over and over again on these maps is that this area specifically, and this area specifically, are places where people, it's not that they don't feel welcome, but they don't necessarily feel safe, they don't necessarily feel comfortable. And there's a difference between maybe an imminent danger and just like an overall, like an uneasy sense, but it's also a concern for the people that are living there. It's not as much pushing people away or saying, oh, this other person, this other that. There's a genuine concern. What's going on here? How do we, what is the issue here? How can this get resolved? Something that I heard over and over again, and particularly around that comfortability question was, that's my neighborhood, but it's not my turf. If I walk around there, it's not for me, or it's not for even the people that are living there, and they're getting pushed farther and farther out. I keep going backwards. Okay, so looking at the data, what we can see is that this fell off, but what the legend was supposed to be saying was that the darker the color gets, the older the typical age of housing is. That's because this is mismatched. That's what that's happening. Sorry, I just realized that was a mistake. The main lesson to be pulling, and I'm sure we're going to see the actual map for this on a different slide, is that this is an area where there is an older median age of housing. So typically the areas that have older housing have less investment. Those are the areas that don't have the nicer sidewalks put in. Those are the areas that don't have good lighting at night. Those are the areas where those same sorts of effects pile on and pile on and pile on. And those folks don't feel like they are supposed to remain in the neighborhood. They don't feel like it's a neighborhood for them anymore because they see, all of the investment that's happening over here with the newer housing and saying, okay, well, they're putting in the nice sidewalks, they're putting in restaurants here. They just put in all this money on this really nice park that if I go to, someone might call the cops on me. That was also a question, I'm going backwards again. That was also okay. So that was also a question that was asked, is where do you see police? Which is an interesting question to ask because then people think that you're trying to, when you ask where do you see police in close proximity to where do you see people hanging around, people get concerned, like I'm not trying to snitch on anyone, it's not that kind of situation, you have to explain, it's not about that, no one's going to see this, don't worry. But it's interesting to see the connotation that people pull from that because it's supposed to be saying, okay, well, are the police here for you or are the police coming for you? How do you view that? Some people would do the mapping exercise and say, yeah, I'm not seeing nearly enough police. Where are the police? I see them over here by this new construction. I see them over here because there's heavy crime, but I don't see them patrolling. And other people would say, yeah, I see the police over here and it's a problem and I'm scared. So I was also looking at, where do you see the most new construction? Where do you see house finance? Again, trying to get at the sense of how investment in the community is concentrated and how forces of displacement are moving through the community. So in the orange are places where people called out repeatedly that there's a lot of new construction. It's not really a surprise if you've been through Third Ward, you know that. And the purple areas are places where people see a lot of those bandit house buying signs. I buy ugly houses, I buy houses for cheap, whatever. Cash for houses, I'll buy your house no matter what. And people are saying when they're doing these activities, yeah, I receive a flyer like that in the mail every day. And what you see on the map is that the areas where people are receiving those by and large are areas that are right butted up against the areas with all the new construction. So they're seeing signs over and over and over again. Okay, there's all this new construction coming in, there's all this new investment. This is meant to push me out. This is a sign, right? Yes, so this was supposed to be, this is flipped, that's what it is. Okay, but we'll just leave it because it's flipped. So another set of questions were, where do you see people hanging out and where do you see kids playing? And what we're going to see again, so the orange is people hanging out and the purple are kids playing. It's a little small and I apologize for that. But what we see is that there are only a very few amount of places here at this park, and a little park here, where there are places for kids to be playing, where there are safe places for kids to be hanging out. People hanging out isn't meant to have a negative connotation. It's not necessarily a bad thing or a good thing, depending on who you were asking. Some people were saying, yeah, I don't feel comfortable walking up the street because there's that large group of men that's always hanging out at that gas station, and that makes me uncomfortable. And other people were saying, yeah, my friends hang out at this corner, and it would be nice for there to be a space for them to be in that was like out of the elements or that had chairs. all of those are elements of how a community is functioning. These pictures are too small. This one just showed up over and over again. We're going to see. No, that was just an error or something. I didn't change the label on that. My apologies. So what I was supposed to be getting at in this slide, and I did not change the title, was looking at where Project Row Houses is doing its development. Because what I'm very interested in, and will be going into in my next year of research, is how arts-based organizations are going about the process of neighborhood preservation. So looking at these areas where they planted housing, here and this area in particular, as we saw light up on all of those cultural maps over and over again, is kind of a difficult area. It's an area with not a lot of investment. And then this area up here, that is a newer investment. How are arts institutions, arts organizations trying to stabilize a community? What is the process that they're going through? Is it something that's really invested in the community? Is it something that's coming from a more external lens? And how can this process be tweaked, or how can it be expanded? If this is a model that's replicable, and there are other organizations that are doing it, then it's something that can be studied, and it's something that can be tested, and it's something that can be talked about with other communities. So it's again trying to get to this idea of how we can start to share the same language. Those are some sticky notes from the presentation, or from the lectures. People are having these same experiences in different cities, and there are other organizations that are also doing this sort of development work that Project Row Houses is doing, and in the next year I'm going to be going out to some other organizations across the country to talk to them and see what their process has been like, to see how communities are responding to the development that they're doing, and to see, you know, what's working, what's not working. How can we start to really think about putting this into a language that more communities can have access to? This is preserve Black history. So in addition to doing the maps that I was showing you, I've also been participating in some design charrettes that Project Row Houses has been doing around this specific housing. It's a set of row houses that have been in sort of disrepair, and they purchased them and fixed them up, and it's been very interesting to see because all of the original residents are being kept in those houses. They're living there, no one was moved out, nothing like that. But the idea being, okay, well, if we're going to invest in this housing and try to preserve affordability in the neighborhood, how do you make it a space that residents still feel like it's their own? I am not claiming this project as my own. I was there and I was helping with some of the exercises, but it's not my project. But it's something that I'm going to continue to be involved in over the next year. And so they've been going through some design charrettes, planning out this courtyard space that's in the backyard that is shared between all the community members. And going through that process, you hear people trying to get to this same language of, okay, well, what is it that we value in this space that's for all of us? What does all of us mean? Does it mean the neighbors outside of this square? Does it mean just this square? How do we get to a point where it's something that everyone can agree on? And on a micro scale, it's very interesting for how affordability can work. But on a macro scale, I'm interested in seeing how this process fits in with how some other processes across the country have been going, and how can we look at this as a case study for developing out, for preserving, for rehabilitating affordable housing. So in the 3 phases of the project that I'm working on, I've been working on the community mapping exercises and design charrettes. I am about to start interviewing those other organizations that I mentioned, but my ultimate goal coming out of this is going to be connecting those different organizations to each other and with the communities that are very involved in this work, because I think that there is a huge vacuum of information that happens where people are all approaching this and kind of treating it like it's lightning in a bottle of, okay, well, we can develop this housing, we can do this thing, we can do this great cultural arts programming, but everyone is treating it like it's the first time it's ever happened over and over and over again. And in the same way that displacement keeps happening, these innovative ideas keep happening, but they have to start from ground floor every time because we're not having these conversations. So in the long run, I'm going to be working on a website and hopefully putting together some pamphlets and some booklets around how how to make this into a shared language and a shared tool set.